This has been another day of dramatic developments in the global crisis which centres on Ukraine. And the most important aspect of this crisis is what is happening in the gas market in Europe. Now, back in March, President Putin of Russia made an announcement that from now on, or rather from late April, May, when the existing payment arrangements had been exhausted, the Russians would start insisting on payment in rubles for gas that they sold to Europe. President Putin explained this by saying that it no longer made any sense for Russia to accept payments in euros or dollars because the payments in these currencies, which have to be placed abroad or converted into Russian currencies, could be frozen at any time by Western governments as part of their sanctions against Russia, and that to persist in such an arrangement would mean, in effect, that Russia was providing gas for nothing, for free, which is obviously an unacceptable arrangement. Well, European governments and the European Commission, with the exception of Hungary, all said that they would not comply with President Putin's directive. Chancellor Scholz of Germany telephoned Vladimir Putin to find out what the arrangement amounted to, and Putin explained to him that the arrangement would work in the following way: that there would be an account opened by any European company which wanted to buy gas from Russia at Gazprom Bank, which is a Russian bank, but one which the European Union has not yet sanctioned. The payments would be made by European companies to Gazprom Bank in euros. Gazprom Bank would then convert these euros into rubles and pay the rubles into a corresponding account for these companies within Gazprom Bank, and from that account the payment would then be made directly to Gazprom. Now, it was unclear to what extent this arrangement breached the EU sanctions. In my opinion, and in President Putin's opinion, and in fact in the opinion of many people that I have seen, it did not breach the sanctions at all. But that was what the European Commission initially said, and it was the advice it initially gave. Well, a few days ago, the European Union walked back that advice. It said that, in fact, this arrangement that President Putin has outlined does not actually violate the sanctions. Now, when it did that, in an advisory note, it circulated to EU member states and presumably to EU companies involved in the power generation industry in Europe. He did not make clear that this arrangement was in fact an arrangement that President Putin had suggested. Rather, the EU Commission, as it often does, suggested that this was its proposal for how companies could pay for gas, for Russian gas, and that it would not violate the sanctions. They would pay the money to Gazprom Bank in euros. Gazprom Bank would then open the accounts, the ruble accounts, convert the money into rubles, pay it into these accounts, into these ruble accounts, and from then the money would go to Gazprom. So what Putin originally proposed, the EU pretended that it had proposed. Anyway, that was a rather strange development. That was a few days ago. But over the next couple of days, we all waited to see what exactly was going to happen, whether EU companies and EU governments would actually go forward with this arrangement or whether they would not. And if they didn't, if they refused to comply, what action would the Russians take? Well, yesterday the Russians took action. Poland, predictably, and Bulgaria, rather less predictably, refused to agree to act on this arrangement. And Gazprom accordingly made it clear yesterday that it would stop gas deliveries to Poland and Bulgaria. This provoked fury and outrage from some people in Europe. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has come forward and said that this Russian demand and these Russian actions amount to energy blackmail. Now, I have to say, that does seem to me somewhat a case of the pot calling the kettle black. After all, you could say exactly the same, perhaps with greater force, about the sanctions the EU and the Western powers have imposed on Russia. Why are sanctions, which are after all a mechanism for economic coercion intended to achieve a political outcome, not blackmail, whilst Russia demanding payment in its own currency for gas it delivers? Why is that blackmail? I mean, I don't really see the logic of this. There's an argument, a plausible legal argument, that requiring European companies to agree and submit to this arrangement redraws the energy supply, the gas supply contracts. It's a unilateral variation by Gazprom of those contracts, which is technically a breach of contract, and that is true. I would say that it is not unusual for companies involved in commercial dealings with each other to vary contracts unilaterally all the time, changing payment mechanisms and that sort of thing. And more often than not, these rather technical arrangements are complied with and payments continue to be made in accordance with the new procedures. I mean, this is absolutely standard in the commercial world, as anybody who's worked in the commercial world will know. I'm not entirely sure why this procedure that the Russians have outlined is one that is going to cause such fundamental violations to the contracts that have been made as to essentially to amount to what lawyers would call a fundamental breach of contract. I don't really see it in that way at all. But anyway, that's what Ursula von der Leyen has said. But of course, her saying this, to some extent, flows against the agreements, the guidance that the EU Commission itself gave a few days ago, in which it appeared to suggest that there was nothing fundamentally inappropriate or wrong about President Putin's proposal. Now, I'm going to here express my own view. I think the Poles in particular have taken this step, not so much because they want to create, they genuinely believe that this demand from the Russians violates EU sanctions, but because, as is consistently their policy, they want to escalate tensions. They want to make it more difficult for other European states and European companies to comply with this proposal from President Putin. And they want to create a crisis, another crisis in relations between the EU and Russia. And it's perhaps not surprising that the Poles would choose this moment to do that. Firstly, they must have been somewhat concerned by certain comments by the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell. Josep Borrell said that at the conclusion of this crisis in Ukraine, there would have to be some sort of attempt to rebuild relations between Russia and the EU. He qualified that by saying that it would have to be done on a completely new basis and that the Russians would have to understand that they shouldn't misbehave in the way they've supposedly been doing. But anyway, Borrell did seem to be looking forward to some kind of, if not rapprochement with the Russians, at least some sort of return to some kind of relationship with them, some kind of dialogue with them. And of course, that isn't something that the Polish government wants to see at all. And it's not just that, of course, but I mean, I suspect that the Poles have also been increasingly concerned by the military developments in Ukraine itself, where things are now going badly wrong for Ukraine. I will come to that later in this program. and maybe they also want to escalate the crisis in some way. Poland has been agitating for weeks for a complete energy embargo on Russia, and one senses that the Poles have become increasingly frustrated and dismayed by the fact that other European countries, notably Germany, are showing increasing doubts about the wisdom of doing so, and have been backed in those doubts by no less a person than the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. So it's perhaps not surprising that the Poles have taken this, to pick this moment to take a stand and to escalate this crisis in the way that they have done, refusing to comply with this Russian arrangement, perhaps hoping that this is all a bluff from the Russians and that they could call it, and if not, creating more tensions, more crisis between the EU and the Russians, which might trigger an actual energy embargo of Russia, which is what the Poles, as I said, have been pushing for some time. Well, that may be what will happen, but at the moment, all the indications point in a somewhat different direction. Because as I understand it, there have been now reports circulating that a whole group of energy companies, EU energy companies, we don't know yet which ones, but Uniper, which is one of the big German companies, have apparently agreed to work with this arrangement. And they've apparently at least 5 of them have done so. And Germany, for its part, is saying that energy flows to Germany, gas flows to Germany, continue for the moment unimpeded. So the risk is that unless the EU itself gets ahead of this and comes to some kind of collective decision, EU energy companies, which of course private companies, will take this matter into their own hands, submit to Putin's arrangement, buy their gas through this complex arrangement, which will ultimately mean that Gazprom receives the money in rubles. So that's, I suspect, what will happen. It's not impossible, however, that people like that the Poles will somehow get their way. I can't really believe that the Germans, the Austrians, the Italians, all of these people would really want to be put in that position. I think that they've now figured out that a complete blockade of Russian energy imports into the European Union would plunge Europe into an extremely severe recession. There's already doubts and uncertainties about whether the EU is even capable of blocking oil imports, but there seems to be a universal consensus that closing off gas imports would be a massive mistake and a huge disaster. So I suspect that despite all the rhetoric, we will see eventually more and more EU companies and EU states fall into line. Austria, the Chancellor there has flip-flopped. He appeared at one point to say that Austria was going ahead, accepting this deal, this mechanism that Putin has proposed. He then said that he hadn't actually said that. It's not clear to me exactly what he is saying at the moment, but I suspect that over the next couple of days and weeks, we will see the European Union collectively come to a decision in some form, maybe not a public form, whereby they comply with what President Putin is demanding of them. If they don't, well, we saw what a premonition of what the outcome would be. There's been another leap in gas prices in the European Union, adding fuel to the inflation fire. And I think that this is not something that most Europeans certainly would want to see, and not many people in European governments would want to see either. Certainly European business people will not want to see it. So anyway, we will see where this goes over the next couple of days. My guess is, as I said, that Putin will eventually get his way. The fact that European companies are taking the plunge and making that decision suggests to me that before very long, they all will, to a greater or lesser degree. That will leave Poland and Bulgaria out on a limb, though I suspect that they will be joined in that by the 3 Baltic states. And already we're hearing talk that there's going to have to be reverse flow arrangements whereby Russian gas goes to Germany, the Germans pay for it, it's then re-exported by Germany to Poland in some kind of roundabout mechanism. Incredibly expensive, incredibly complicated, completely unreasonable, but probably that's what's going to happen. Bulgaria, by contrast, says that it's going to try and get its gas from Azerbaijan, but that it's not expecting to get any before the fall. And we're also hearing reports that EU energy companies are now intending to step up their buying of Russian gas over the summer in a desperate attempt to fill the EU's underground gas reserves before the winter, when hopefully the Europeans hope to start scaling down their purchases of Russian gas. I ought to say that in relation to the second, it's all very ironic actually, because the Europeans have been talking about the fact that they're going to reduce gas purchases from Russia, energy purchases from Russia by the autumn. The way they're doing that, since alternative mechanisms of supply from the United States, from Algeria, from Qatar, have simply failed to bear fruit, the way they're doing that is actually by increasing purchases of gas from Russia now, so that when autumn comes, they can pretend that they're cutting back on gas purchases from Russia, when in fact they've actually increased them over the course of the summer. But anyway, one way or the other, I think it is more likely, much more likely than not, that they will comply with President Putin has demanded. And the fact that the Russians have cut off the Poles and the Bulgarians in the way that they have done, showing that this is a serious decision and not a bluff, I think that will probably harden the decisions across Europe to comply with what President Putin is asking them to do. So that's my take of the situation at the moment, but obviously in a mood of anger and panic, and as Ursula von der Leyen's really outlandish comments about blackmail show, it's far from certain that European leaders, European governments will do what seems to me the obvious and logical thing. Anyway, we will see how this turns out, but as I said, for the record and for the moment, I expect the Europeans to comply. And if the European Union itself, as a collective political entity, cannot make a decision or won't make a decision, I expect European companies to do it by themselves. They obviously have obligations to their customers. They need the gas. The only place they can realistically get it from is Russia, and they will comply with an arrangement the European Commission has now told them would not breach the sanctions which have been imposed. So we will see where all this goes. It's a high-stakes poker game, but it seems to me that the Russians undoubtedly possess the stronger cards. Anyway, that's the situation with gas. The other big stories are Transnistria and the situation on the ground in Ukraine. And I'm going to turn briefly to the last point first, because we're now getting increasing news of steady advances by the Russian military and the Donbass militia in Donbass. More and more villages and settlements and small towns are falling under Russian control. The Ukrainian forces in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are increasingly becoming bottled up, as are the forces that the Ukrainians have in the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk conurbation. I should say that there was talk some days ago of the Ukrainians with pulling back from Severodonetsk, Predictably, perhaps, they've not done so. Whenever the question of retreat arises, the Ukrainians reject it. They continue to do what seems to me, from every point of view, to be unwise. They continue to dig in, defending unsustainable positions, even at the cost of many lives. And I'm afraid I'm getting now more and more reports that the Ukrainians have been hurling more and more troops in what are looking to be extremely costly and unsuccessful counterattacks against the Russian forces. And apparently there have been very severe losses. The Russians are now claiming that Ukrainian losses run into the hundreds every day. Of course, one can't confirm this, but it seems consistent with what I'm hearing. And unfortunately, and I hope this isn't true, but it does seem increasingly as if it may be, it appears that many of these troops that have been hurled by the Ukrainians into these increasingly desperate counterattacks are reservists. And I'm seeing increasing photographs and pictures of some of these people who have been captured by the Russians or who have surrendered. And I have to say, they looking increasingly like older men, less fit, not perhaps the kind of people you would expect frontline soldiers to be. So this seems to me an increasingly costly defense of Donbass, with the relentless shelling continuing and from the Russians continuing, also wreaking enormous damage to the Ukrainian forces. And now I understand that there's think tanks in the United States. There's some think tank not known to me called the Institute of War Studies. I believe it might be a neocon think tank. Most of these think tanks are. But even it is apparently admitting that the Russians are making steady, incremental advances in Donbass, in Ukraine, and that this is now increasingly becoming increasingly clear that the situation of the Ukrainian troops in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, is becoming desperate. And the Russians, whilst on the topic of eastern Ukraine, have also been releasing pictures of the Azovstal factory with superimposed images of where they say the bunkers where the Ukrainian troops and the civilians are, where those bunkers are located underneath the factory. Now, of course, that's the Russians making these claims, so I have no conceivable way of knowing whether or not these claims are true. I suspect they probably are, and I suspect that by now at least the Russians have a pretty clear idea of where these Ukrainian troops and civilians under the Azovstal factory actually are. I remain of the view that before very long we will start to see increasing numbers of surrenders from the Azovstal factory as food and ammunition and all of the other supplies underneath the Azovstal factory start increasingly to run out. In the meantime, we've had all kinds of statements from the United States and from other Western countries about fighting the Russians to a standstill in Ukraine, about sending military supplies to Ukraine. And here I'm going to make a number of general observations. We've seen a large number of, well, objectively a large number of artillery and other types of equipment being supplied by the Western powers to Ukraine. It looks like a hodgepodge of different weapon systems from many different Western countries, all of very difficult to integrate, I would have thought, in the Ukrainian military, and massively complicating the Ukrainian army's already extremely overstretched and perhaps fragmented logistics chain. Bernhard, who is a writer who has apparently served in the German army, the Bundeswehr, and who is a tank officer, and who writes as The Moon of Alabama, has said that the 50 Gepard anti-tank vehicles that Germany is supplying to Ukraine, and which have been misrepresented in much of the media as tanks, are old weapon systems designed in the 1960s, which entered service in the 1970s. They're essentially outdated in the modern battlefield, and they are extremely complicated and difficult to use, and that he estimates it would take around a year for the Ukrainians to train up to the level where they could actually use them. I would say that these lumbering, heavy vehicles, it seems to me, in the absence of a proper logistics train, would probably not be able to be very mobile anyway in this war. And if it really is going to take a whole year before they can be integrated into the Ukrainian military, well, this is, as Bernhardt suggests, a token delivery of weapons. And I have to say, I'm getting increasing numbers of reports that a lot of these Western weapon systems that have been supplied to Ukraine are not working as they should. I've said previously that the Javelin apparently is expensive and heavy. It works well when it can be made to work at all, but apparently in this extremely dynamic battlefield, it's over expensive and over complicated, and is more than the Ukrainians can realistically use. I'm hearing the same thing about the anti-aircraft systems that Britain has been supplying to Ukraine, that they're available in limited number, that they're large and bulky and expensive and cannot be moved around easily. And as I think I discussed in a recent program, it seems that the Switchblade drone, kamikaze drone, about which much was expected, doesn't work properly in the very heavy electronic warfare and anti-aircraft conditions that the Russians are able to throw up to cover their forces. So these Western weapon systems may not be doing all the things that the Western leaders have expected that they might do. Well, on top of that, and perhaps especially in response to some rather unwise statements made by the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin about the US wanting to break Russia in Ukraine or to weaken Russia, the Russians have now stepped up attacks on Ukraine's civilian transport infrastructure. Now, the Russians, until fairly recently, for example, have not been bombing Ukrainian railway bridges, Ukrainian electrical supply stations, and they've also allegedly been extremely careful to attack Ukrainian supply trains, in part because allegedly, and I want to again say allegedly, the Ukrainians mix civilian and commercial freight vehicles in their trains. The commercial vehicles carry the weapon systems, and of course the civilian carriages carry the civilians. And the Russians have been unwilling to attack these trains. Well, apparently attacking the bridges, attacking the electric supply stations is going to paralyze much or most of Ukraine's railway system. And given that railways are the means that Ukraine uses to send heavy equipment to the battlefront, that could very well clog up the entire Western supply effort. Underwhelming though it probably is, and keep most of these weapon systems in Western Ukraine. I'm going to make a supposition of my own here, which is that I wonder whether realistically it's a good idea to send these weapon systems to the Ukrainian military in Donbass anyway, given that that military is looking to find itself, it seems to me, in a completely untenable position. It seems to me that sending advanced or at least expensive weapon systems to the forces in Donbass is a case of reinforcing failure and perhaps the real Western purpose in supplying these weapon systems is not to supply the forces, the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, but to give the remaining Ukrainian forces in central and western Ukraine equipment, an opportunity to rebuild with new equipment in order to resist any future Russian attacks once the main Ukrainian army in Donbass is finally defeated. Well, that might be an over-sophisticated approach to this war. It may not even be a correct one. As I said many times, I'm not a military person, and I don't pretend to understand strategy and military tactics very well. But I do wonder whether, in fact, there has ever really been an intention to send some of these vehicles all the way to Donbass over these huge distances into a battle where they would surely either be quickly destroyed or, worse still, captured by the Russians. Anyway, that seems to me a general overview of the military situation in Ukraine. There continues to be a great deal of concern about what is happening in Transnistria. And of course, the British media, very predictably, is saying that all of these attacks that have been taking place in Transnistria, this breakaway region of Moldova, where there is a Russian military base, and which is in conflict with the central Moldovan government, that somehow the Russians themselves who are launching these attacks in Moldova or staging these attacks in Moldova in order to justify Russia's extension of the war in Moldova. Well, I'm going to say straight away, I don't have any information, any direct information from the ground, either to corroborate or refute these claims, but they make absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. Why would the Russians, at this moment in time, want to extend the war into Moldova when they have not yet finished their main operation in Ukraine? I don't see the logic of this at all. I've not seen any explanation for that logic. I would have thought that extending the conflict into Moldova at this time would not be what the Russians would want to see. So I think that I can't see how it could possibly be the Russians who are doing this. It seems to me that it's much more likely to be someone in Ukraine who's doing this. And of course, the Ukrainians in the meantime have been launching pinpoint attacks, or what look like sabotage attacks, on Russian installations in the Russian border regions near the Ukrainian border. And it seems to me that these attacks in Transnistria follow the same pattern. The one thing I'm not sure about is whether the Ukrainian tactic is to distract the Russians, to make the Russians ease on their offensive in Donbass by perhaps dispersing troops to other places to try to contain whatever problems there are along the border, the Russian border with Ukraine, or perhaps even into Transnistria. Whether that is the Ukrainian tactic, or whether the Ukrainians are actually trying to create a crisis in Moldova, in Transnistria, to extend the war, in other words, in order to perhaps try and get Western countries or NATO countries like Romania, which has historic and linguistic connections to Moldova, to bring Romania into the war. I don't know yet what the position is. I suspect that if it is the latter, there are some people in the United States, in the US government, particularly in the Pentagon, who will probably not be happy. Unfortunately, it's also likely that there are hardliners in Washington who, perhaps increasingly alarmed by the direction of events in Ukraine, might be tempted to expand the war in that way. Anyway, we shall have to wait and see what happens. I mean, I am sorry if I have to always say this, but in a dynamic and complex situation, it's never easy to make definite predictions about what will happen. The only thing I will say, and about which I am confident, is that whatever does happen, the Russians will not let it distract them from their priority, which is to grind down and destroy the Ukrainian army in Donbass. That army's days are numbered. I don't know how much longer it will be able to keep fighting. I'm not a military person, as I've said many times, and I don't know that there's any particular Russian timetable for this offensive in Donbass, this slow motion offensive, as I've heard it being called. But whatever the facts are, it does seem to me that the Russians will focus on completing that part of their mission, will see it through, will grind that Ukrainian army down, and will then, once they've done that, decide what to do next. That may involve some move along the Ukrainian coastline to Transnistria. It may involve them doing something else. I'm not going to try and anticipate or guess. I don't know whether the Russians themselves have any plans. I presume they do. I presume they do have some ideas, but I'm not going to try and second guess what they are. In the meantime, efforts at diplomacy continue, though I also have to say I get this distinct impression that the Russians, for their part, have lost interest in negotiations. They've concluded, or so it seems to me, that the Zelensky government at the moment is not really capable of negotiating a deal with them. And I've heard increasing reports that the Russians are basically no longer conducting negotiations in any serious way. There was an article to that effect in the Financial Times about President Putin having lost interest in negotiations. And more importantly, perhaps, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov essentially said the same thing in a press conference he had with Guterres, the UN Secretary General, who has just recently visited Moscow. By the way, whilst I am on the topic of Guterres' visit, it's quite clear to me that Guterres went to Moscow in part in order to mend fences with the Russians. He'd deeply annoyed the Russians at the outset of the war by appearing to take a pro-Western and pro-Ukrainian position. In Moscow, he was much more careful, and perhaps, and predictably, this has now opened him up to criticism from some Western quarters. I saw a furious editorial about Guterres and his visit to Moscow in the Daily Telegraph, the British newspaper. The Daily Telegraph, which is known to be very close to the British government and which made known its deep anger. And I suspect the British government's deep anger with Guterres' decision to do his job and to go to Moscow and to have talks with the Russians there. Anyway, there we are. The big news, as I said, is the poker game over gas. I expect that the Russians will win the poker game. I think they have all the strong cards, and more to the point, I think they know what cards the other side has, and that of course enables them to call any bluff that the Europeans may pull. I would say that the risk is that in a situation like this, the Europeans might say things which they might intend as a bluff, but when that bluff is called, they might be reluctant to go back on what they've said, and that could very easily put everybody in Europe in a very, very difficult position. But I do hope that sensible councils do eventually prevail, and that the Europeans do finally accept that these proposals that have been floating around Europe for temporary blackouts, restrictions on production, changing thermostat settings, wearing woolly pullovers, putting on extra blankets, that none of this is really workable, and that this would, if seen through, lead to a severe crisis in the European economy. The gamble appears to be that the Russians would exhaust themselves first in such a battle. I think this is a profound misjudgment and misunderstanding of the situation. I think that the Europeans have completely miscalculated the extent of Russian economic resiliency, and I think that the Europeans perhaps ought to take a step back, think finally about where they've positioned themselves, and start to make rational decisions based on self-interest. And that, of course, brings me to the most rational decision of all, which is that with the European Union now finding itself in an increasingly precarious energy position, and with Ukraine now unquestionably losing on the battlefield, with even the British media and these think tanks in Washington starting to admit the fact, the right thing to do is to put aside these absurd claims by people like Lloyd Austin and Blinken about achieving victory against Russia and Ukraine, breaking Russia and all that. It is to negotiate peace. Now, the very last thing I'm going to say is that Nikolai Patrushev, the very powerful secretary of Russia's Security Council, has said that if this war continues for very much longer, the Ukrainian state might collapse and break up, fragment into various statelets. And one can already see steps being prepared for breakaways in Kherson, Zaporozhye, and other places. To be very clear, if the Ukrainian state does break up in that kind of fashion, this will be only a transition before all of these eastern Ukrainian regions are eventually absorbed into Russia. And I don't think anybody should be in any long-term doubt about this. It might take years, even decades, but that's what the eventual end point would be. Do people in Europe really want to see that happen? Do they really want to see Ukraine destroyed? Do they really want to see the European economy propelled into a steep recession, made uncompetitive against East Asian and North American competitors, much better supplied with energy and raw materials than they are? Is that what the European Union really wants? I would have thought logically not. So, make peace. It can be done. There are still proposals out there which, though perhaps less favourable to the West and to Ukraine than they might have been a few weeks ago if the apparent breakthrough in Istanbul had been seen through, nonetheless, they would still allow some kind of functioning Ukrainian state to survive in some form, and it would also prevent the European economy from going into deep recession and facing indefinite structural problems. It seems to me that the logic of taking this step, of seeking peace, is overwhelming. It is overwhelming from a political, diplomatic, and economic point of view, and I've discussed in many programs the humanitarian aspect of it also. It does mean European leaders finally breaking with the neocons who have achieved so much influence over the US government in Washington and acting finally in European and indeed Ukrainian interests. And it would also mean that people like Ursula von der Leyen, who's clearly got some kind of visceral complex about Russia would perhaps find that their positions have become politically untenable. But surely it is the right and proper thing to do. Well, we will see whether the Europeans ever reach that point, whether they come to those kind of decisions. Personally, I think it unlikely, but one can only hope. We will see what happens over the next few days. Josep Borrell's comments about seeking some kind of long-term security arrangement with Russia might point in a positive direction. The decision of some EU companies to conform with President Putin's directive might also point in that direction. But these are tentative moves, and one can't be sure that the Europeans will ever follow them through. We will see what happens, what the Europeans do. The only thing I will say is that if they persist in the approach they're taking at the moment, yes, there will be some degree of economic hardship in Russia, though Russia is accustomed to economic hardship and it has a plan to come through, which is more than the Europeans do, by the way. And of course, it has all the resources it needs in terms of energy and food and raw materials to do it. So the Russians will suffer hardship. Ukraine will be destroyed. The European economy will be crippled and will face long-term structural problems. It is difficult to see how we could overcome. And a lot of young men, and perhaps not so young men now, will die. I can't see the logic of that at all, but the decision depends on European leaders, and I have to say they've not been making any good decisions for the time being. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to you joining me again soon in future programs on this channel. Remember that you can join us on Rumble and Locals. If you watch any of our videos, and this video on Rumble, remember you can press that red maroon button and it will take you directly to our Locals homepage, where you can join our community, participate in my Wednesday live streams, post your own exclusive content. And we have lots of other platforms that you can join too. SuperU, the new free speech platform, being one, ODYSEE, for example, being another. And you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there: t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, bomber jackets, hats, whatever, magic mugs. And also, of course, if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. Before I finish, well, thanks to everybody who's managed to get me to the point of having 100,000 subscribers on this channel. Obviously, I could not have done it without you, and I'm extremely grateful to you for all that. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Until then.